But the senator, while indoctrinated, could not explain his toxicity.
You should not listen to men's rights advocates if you want to know what they have to say.
Hello and welcome to Honey Badger Radio. I'm your host, Allison Tiemann, and with me today are Dr. Randa McKim and Hannah Wallen, and this is Honey Badger News 140. Do women want to be oppressed? Is gaming a mental illness? And more. And the end more is Sweden is moving to a consent-based model, and Bitcoin is apparently a currency of hate. So, is there any preference to which item you'd like us to begin with from the panel?
Well, the clickbaitiest one was clearly Bitcoin is a coin of hate, but it's
it's not in the title.
Hilarious.
Do the first one first. We might as well.
Okay, all right. Which one was the first one? Okay, when science won't convince them, we're fucked. By Max Durrett. So just imagine I'm reading this out in his voice. So you should substitute my voice and use his voice. Allow me to quote the following from a Scientific American article. Doing so should provide all the setup needed. Quote, critics of my column see themselves as courageous defenders of scientific truth, and yet they prefer that truth, with the little quotes, that confirms their conviction that inequality reflects biology. If you question these claims, you are a, quotes, social justice warrior. So what does that make them? Social injustice warriors? End quote. A writer named John Hogan for the Scientific American recently wrote an article titled Darwin Was Sexist, and So Are Many Modern Scientists. He complains that evolutionary psychologists like Michael Shermer, Charles Murray, and Jordan Peterson are reinforcing insidious prejudices by trying to explain sex, gender stereotypical behaviors through an evolutionary lens. It's ironic that Hogan accuses evolutionary psychologists of quote-unquote preferring truth that confirms their convictions, when Hogan seems to be doing just the same. For the rest of the article, Hogan tries to support a social constructionist view of why men are prone to aggressive dominant behavior as a sexually reproductive strategy by choosing quote-unquote evidence that supports his own preferred truth. To begin, he says that 12,000 years ago, when our pre-civilization ancestors were nomadic hunter-gatherers, we were relatively peaceful and egalitarian, without any war. Hogan fails to see that with a hunter-gatherer nomadic way of being, there's also a form of sexually reproductive strategy. How? It's easy. Whichever male tends to gather the most resources tends to obtain the best mate. Were women the ones out there hunting so that they could feed helpless children? No. Hogan cites a book titled Mothers and Others, written by anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hardy, who argues that war and patriarchy are relatively recent cultural developments, and that prior to war emerging 12,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers were fiercely egalitarian and went to great lengths to downplay competition. Well, do you think that might be the case because there were no civilizations? There were fewer people on the planet? We were always moving around, and our biggest threats at the time weren't other humans but indiscriminate carnivores? Just because war didn't exist till 12,000 years ago, that doesn't account entirely for men's tendency to embrace dominant sexually reproductive strategies. Unfortunately, yours truly, the sexist Simpsons king alive, the sexiest Simpsons kin alive. Sorry, Matt.
That was
Max.
a Simpson slip there.
Unfortunately, yours truly, the sexiest Simpson kid alive, cannot be with you today. If I were, I would join with my fellow panelists in lamenting that dumb fucks like Hogan can have a paid job at a publication called The Scientific American, and yet I can deconstruct his argument via Socratic method at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. Happy New Year, motherfuckers. Boy, he really likes to just go out with a bang there. All right,
11
thank you,
a.m. on a
Max.
Tuesday afternoon, though, is kind of a little odd.
Well, that's when he was presumably writing this.
It says
Yeah.
here 5 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon.
I know
Oh,
that's
Has the blog
I-
been updated for
yeah. The blog has been updated. It was
That's good.
updated. It was updated by me, but all right. Well, first of all, I want to disagree with Max. A lot of the resources, the calorie resources in hunter-gatherer societies are actually acquired by women. So they're gathering most of the calories to feed the tribe. What tends to happen is that the male members of a hunter-gatherer community will gather higher status resources. So they'll be the ones gathering game, honey, interesting artifacts that they bring back to the tribe and they all sort of speculate over. So there is actually a bit of a sexual dimorphism in hunter-gathering societies, obviously, because the women are doing the gathering, the men are doing the hunting. And it does actually relate to status as well, because the things that men bring back are the things that give them more status within the tribe. That generally are stuff that you would reserve for a celebratory feast, or you'd share with the whole tribe. It's sort of like, oh, look at what I found. It's pretty awesome, isn't it? So even in hunter-gatherer tribes, there is a hierarchy. And part of the hierarchy is that men will tend to pursue the more higher status items in the totem pole of the hunter-gatherer tribe, which is not to say that women aren't important too and not valued in a hunter-gatherer tribe, but there is that tendency, and the tendency is probably there because, as we have shown with actual science and studies, men will compete with each other in pro-social ways like this. And this is a very pro-social way to compete. You compete over getting the most interesting rock and the most amount of honey and the most interestingly furred animal. That's fairly pro-social. It's not aggressive. It's except for the hunting aspect, but it is a form of competition. And there are some tribes where the competition will take the form of carving the most elaborate flute or being able to one up another man in a dance. This kind of competition is very much in hunter-gatherer societies. They may not be the same as warfare competition, but there is also warfare in hunter-gatherer societies as well. Quite a few of them are actually very violent, and warfare is another aspect of men cooperating to compete violently with the men of other tribes. So I don't think that, and like I said, this is actually in science. Testosterone increases the desire to raise in the social ranks. The way that the man in question will rise in the social ranks will depend on what that society values. If that society values an extremely elaborate flute, that's what he'll create. If the society values the ability to leap off an iceberg onto the back of a gigantic whale and shove your spear in to kill it, that's what they'll compete over. If society values technology, that's what they'll compete over creating, because it's been proven that testosterone increases the desire for pro-social competition. And how this individual can simply say, just wave that away and say, oh yeah, these studies, they just are meaningless. We don't have to look at them. And also the history of this, because every single culture has some hierarchical competition between men. It doesn't have to be incredibly violent. It doesn't have to be incredibly aggressive. It doesn't have to be cutthroat. I mean, whoever carves the most elaborate flute, that's a pretty mild competition, but you'll see that even among hippies. Hippie men compete with each other with how good a spiced latte they make, or whatever it is that, hipster and hippie guys do.
Yeah, there's a big difference there. Hippie guys will compete over how natural they are and how laid back
Exactly.
they are and how many drugs they've tried, and hipsters
And
are how out of style they are.
how well they play the acoustical guitar. This is
I've taken all of them and I'm very good at it, by the way.
Fan those feathers,
I
Meg.
want to know how estrogen has affected you. If you've taken all of them,
Oh my.
I bet there's a few I have tried you haven't.
It certainly explains the
They're
man
just not
tits.
they're just not mood altering intended to be taken by men.
So I think it's patently ridiculous that this guy's just sort of rejecting the science that doesn't appeal to him, because he prefers this narrative that women were oppressed, or women are not part of these hierarchies because they're being oppressed by the men. They're being excluded from these hierarchies by men, rather than men just being naturally pro-social. If you put 12 boys in an empty field with some sort of round object, how quickly will they invent a sport? You throw it in.
They don't need a
Sorry?
round object. The boys at my son's school invented a zombie game that they used to play all the time, at recess and everything. And it was like a combination of tag and some other things, but it was still a game that had a set of rules that they came up with together,
And it was competitive.
and it was competitive.
And the other thing is that a lot of these kids look at skateboarding. It has a lot of hierarchical in terms of being able to do tricks, and boys invented it, and young men invented it, and for the most part, society tried to stop them from doing it. And this is the case with a lot of this stuff. Society is trying to stop this kind of pro-social cooperative competition between boys. They're not actually encouraging it. It's just a natural expression of testosterone, high amounts of testosterone. And what's really interesting to me about all of this, of course, he wants to not use the naturalistic explanation for why men engage in these competitive, cooperative hierarchies pro-socially. He doesn't want to use the naturalistic explanation that it's based on hormones, because he wants to ascribe it to a system in which men just hate women just because, and want to oppress them and keep all the goodies for themselves, rather than there being a contributing factor to this pro-social competition, which is women like it. Women flock to the men on top of these pro-social hierarchies, or the top of these hierarchies. They don't even have to be pro-social, because they also flock to the serial killers and the Genghis Khans of the world. And there is an aspect that women have selected for this behavior, and surprise, 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 the behavior that women like somehow found its way into men's genes. What? This just remarkable, isn't it? Okay.
I do think it's interesting that the guy does say, he does claim in his article that these societies had no war, that they were entirely peaceful, and there was no violent competition and no conflict and all this. But every time they find a frozen specimen or a mummified specimen, that just happened to die in a place where it dried out just right and everything, it's always been a victim of some sort of violence. It's always been a man who was a victim of some sort of violence. In very rare cases, they've had some female ones show up, but it's always been, when they find a male one, it's always a guy that was a victim of violence. But these societies weren't violent. Just these are all flukes. All the ones that they found are flukes, right? And the fact that there is documentation and evidence of violence between various tribes and so on, he's just ignoring that because it doesn't fit. So it's and the other thing about this is that bothered me. All right, if we're talking about way back pre, I don't know, like Stone Age tribes, right? Basically hunter gatherer tribes before there was technology, so they didn't have the types of shelters that would successfully protect them from large animals. They would have still had to compete with nature on a level that we don't. And having to compete with nature on a level that we don't means they did have an adversarial relationship to deal with. Since they have an adversarial relationship to deal with that is compelling all encompassing, extremely threatening, and keeps them busy, that's going to distract from their ability to have adversarial relationships with each other on the scale that we do now. So it's like he's deliberately putting Stone Age tribes, hunter gatherer tribes, through the filter of today's ease of dealing with nature to avoid admitting that, hey, those adversarial relationships have always been there. It's just that there's not always been the same conflict. Sometimes the conflict was more with nature than with other humans.
Isn't 40,000 years ago about the time allegedly our branch of hominids apparently
Allegedly.
killed the Neanderthals?
Yeah. Well, you can't say "are" if you're saying kill the Neanderthals, because technically some of us, according to some of this science, if you've got severe allergy problems, you got a widespread variety of allergies and stuff like that, you probably have Neanderthal DNA. So, if somebody gets mad at me on Twitter and calls me a Neanderthal, I'm not going to get annoyed. I'm just going to say, yeah, so.
Yeah, this is evidence that the Neanderthals were not just killed to death; they were raped to death.
Yes.
Oh my God.
They were actually sex
That's
slaves.
it.
Yeah.
Our real ancestors were reavers.
Reavers. Okay. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that population, like genetic science, has indicated now we are a pair bonding species. There is no doubt about that. If you go to any anthropology text, this is a completely non-controversial thing to say. We are a pair bonding species. We usually have one man, one woman in a family group, children plus, uncles, aunts, grandparents, and that's how we would have evolved. In fact, it's looking like our earliest ancestor that was prior to us splitting off from the same tree as the chimpanzees likely was also a pair bonder. I'm not sure, not completely clear on this, but it's likely they were. And there are some aspects of our biology that indicate that we are pair bonders. For example, if we weren't pair bonders, men would probably have canines about 3 or 4 times longer than they are now. We have an incredibly low sexual dimorphism in the places where you usually see high sexual dimorphism with promiscuous or polygyna, multiple females.
It would be like gorillas. We'd have like 8 foot tall men and 5 foot tall women. It'd be even more nuts than it is now.
Yeah, well, actually, our sexual dimorphism is fairly low. It's about 20% in terms of body mass. And now there's a significant difference in strength, although the question becomes how much of that is the fact that the average modern woman is literally like she's almost her own gender compared to her ancestors who were female ancestors who were spending like 8 hours or 16 hours a day grinding grain, and who comparatively had the muscular and skeletal development of an Olympic athlete who rose, a female Olympic athlete who rose. This would be the average woman 2,000 years ago, would have had the muscular and skeletal development of a female Olympic athlete. Think about that for a second. So some of that is probably just the general physical laziness of the modern woman.
It's amazing what having to compete with nature to survive will do for your body.
Yeah. And but what I wanted to get at when I was talking about pair bonding is at some point in our genetic evolution, there was an incredible pinch point in terms of how many men were reproducing relative to how many women. Now, there might be newer science might actually find different results, but that suggests that 100,000 years ago, something really drastic happened. And the pattern actually does appear to be similar to another type of pattern. And that is domestication, when you massively restrict the amount of males who are able to impregnate females because you want to change the behavior or their looks or how much muscle they have or how much meat they put on. So you restrict the breeding of the males to just those males that have the traits that you want, and then you're breeding like one male to 40 females or whatever. That symptom of domestication happened 100,000 years ago, which suggests that our past is not quite as bucolic as this individual is making it out to be. If we were essentially treating each other like slaves and breeding stock 100,000 years ago. Just putting it out there. All right. So do we want to move on to the next item?
Sounds good. We do have one super chat. Tuna Sandwich gave us $2 and said, "Yay! I made it to a live stream." So welcome to the live stream.
And actually, Hugo of the Riverbank just gave us $1 Canadian and didn't say anything. Just the dollar. Oh. Thanks, Hugo.
Thanks. Okay. I'm just going to go with who will recognize, that would be the World Health Organization, will recognize gaming disorder as a mental health condition in 2018. And this would be by Max. So read it, as I'm reading it out, just pretend you're hearing Max, not me. Here's a story that will hopefully provoke thoughtful discussion rather than blinding rage. And I'm saying that 100% sincerely. The World Health Organization is including gaming disorder in the beta draft for its forthcoming 11th International Classification of Diseases. The WHO defines the disorder as a pattern of persistent or recurrent gaming behavior that may result in significant impairment in personal, family, social, educational, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. This behavior will need to be evident over a period of at least 12 months to merit a diagnosis. It should also be noted that this new entry on gaming disorder includes only a clinical description and not prevention and treatment options, according to Gregory Hartle, a WHO spokesman. Before the skeptics among us jump to conclusions and think that this is somehow another attack on the gaming community, note the following. Chris Ferguson, a professor of psychology at Stetson University in Florida, says that the type of disorder defined in the ICD only applies to, quote, 1% or less of individuals who are gamers. So if you play a lot of video games, you have to play substantially more to be diagnosed with this condition. Having said this, there is still work to be done in creating this diagnosis. As Ferguson says, the definitions that exist within the ICD and the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, are separate and don't fully capture the issue. For example, the DSM definition is built around substance abuse disorder, while the ICD is built around whether gaming interferes with a real life, i.e. not doing your homework, brushing your teeth. Between the two, Ferguson says the IDC is a little better. Yet he says that he doesn't think the WHO's proposal is reflecting a real consensus in the field. He says this because he feels that if one is treating gaming disorder, even though it might only potentially affect 1% of the gaming population, it would be like treating someone with pneumonia with a cough suppressant. You get rid of the cough, but they're still going to have pneumonia. However, a fellow professor of psychology at Iowa State University, Douglas A. Gentile, argues that things like depression and gaming are comorbid conditions. Quote, if you just treat the depression, not gaming, the gaming is likely to come back. This suggests it's a unique condition. With all of this being said, one thing is clear. More research and discussion is needed in order to create appropriate diagnoses. I pray that my fellow Badgers will begin this process in my absence.
There you have it, folks. While we were joking about making feminism a mental condition, and while they were dead serious about making the men's rights movement a terrorist organization, someone in the background was busy trying to make gamers an actual mental condition, and they fucking succeeded.
What's really dumb about this is what they're doing is they're taking a symptom and turning it into a disorder. This is something that I've noticed. This happens with gaming. It does. It happens with every activity that you can get involved in that takes a significant amount of your attention and can be sustained for a long period of time and then retain your interest for a long period of time. And it's not necessarily because of gaming. It can happen with television. It can happen with reading. It can happen with in any recreational activity. And it would be like diagnosing people who are into extreme sports. You know, what do they call them? Adrenaline junkies. Yeah, as actual drug addicts instead of joking around and calling them adrenaline junkies, and doing it whether they're climbing a mountain or standing in front of a train and jumping out of the way at the last minute. One is something that lots of people do and has a sense of achievement at the end of it, and the other is extremely dangerous and stupid. But if they're going to treat them the same way, and they're going to treat overdoing something as a disorder that is unique to gaming, they're going to have to come up with more than plays a lot of games and it interferes with your life, because that disorder already exists with several other things, and it's pretty clear that it is not a gaming disorder. It is things like an addictive personality disorder, an inability to separate fantasy from reality, aka or a la Monsters and Mazes. I don't know how many of you've seen that. That was a Tom Hanks movie, I believe, made in the 80s in response to kids who made the news because having become dysfunctional while suffering mental illness and or on drugs, they had some sort of psychotic break, and it was blamed on their association strictly with Dungeons and Dragons because it manifested in conjunction with Dungeons and Dragons. And it is just stupid. Again, you have that situation where the problem is not necessarily the game or the games or the hobbies or any of that. It is something else behind the obsessiveness or the inability to differentiate between want to do and need to do and things like that. If they're going to limit it to gaming, they're really going to need to come up with more details in this.
Escapism, folks. I had to look up the word just now. I think it accidentally came up on the screen just now. But drapetomania is what the thing was called in the late, I believe, 19th century. It's when slaves have this unaccountable addiction to escaping. And it's obviously, it's only 1% of people who 1% of the sufferers who actually escape, but they're the ones we really need to worry about.
That's a good connection to make too, because and I'm gonna read Joey Jojo's super chat because it's relevant to this. Joey Jojo gave us $2 and said, "Sorry, can't work. Gaming. I don't know this game, so I'm gonna butcher the name probably, but plays more near Automata." So I don't know that one. Somebody will have to tell me about that one. But yeah, that's probably a significant part of this. Sorry, you can't work gaming, And if you look at grass eating men, I think they're called in Japan. There are some guys that won't move out of their parents' house, do not do the traditional thing of trying to get the highest position and best job they possibly can, and competing themselves to death and all of that, and they just settle for what they can get, and they herbivore men, yeah, they play games all day, and I like basically they've stepped. They're sort of like the MGTOW of Japanese society, responding to the dysfunction in Japanese society, wherein they do push men to compete themselves to death, um, to the degree where they don't have a home life, they don't have a work-life balance. They have work, and that's it. And these guys have kind of rejected it.
I would say, first of all, why are they singling out games? Is there a TV addiction entry in the DSM? That's one of the things that sort of raised a red flag for me.
Yeah.
The other thing is, listening to this, I'm just wondering if there's ever going to be an entry in the DM for any kind of mental illness inflicted upon men when they're being told that they are responsible for the evils of society, and that any achievement that they get is a result of ill-gotten gains. And why can't we, if gaming, which is a response, I believe, in many ways to that entire message given to men, that if they succeed, and not only do they have to succeed to be of value as men, but if they do succeed, it's because the patriarchy gave it to them, and they're taking it out of the mouths of women, and they got it illegitimately. And I think a lot of young men are responding to that by checking out and checking into other systems of motivation beyond the monetary, which I think is really the linchpin here, and finding other ways of having a purpose outside of this system, because they've been told that their participation in the system is not just mandatory, but if they do participate in the system, they're hurting women. So they check out, and they check out to games. Are we ever going to pinpoint that as a cause, instead of pinpointing games as a cause of mental illness? How about we pinpoint the rhetoric that men are responsible for society and societal problems by virtue of being men, and that if they succeed, they're obviously stealing from women? Why don't we ever point that out as a source of potential mental illness or mental harm? Silence.
Sorry, I was capturing a super chat.
Yeah, me too. Zamara0292 gives us $2 and says, NEET, not in education, employment, or training, NEET. It's kind of it's pretty much a slur at this point that we have in Britain. Although it generally describes any end of the political sort of spectrum, if you see what I mean. It's rich people who don't need to be in education, employment, or training, or it's poor people who are not in education, employment, or training. It's not quite descriptive in the same way grass eaters or MGTOW are, but it's another sort of thing. Men are dropping out of the system, and we're blaming men for dropping out of the system because it can't be the system that's
yeah, exactly. It can't be.
Notice we have two stories about blaming things that provide people with choices and freedom as being at fault for negative things happening in society. We have this games addiction thing. Now, this is not to say that if somebody has a situation where they're obsessively doing something and it's interfering with their lives, that they should not seek to deal with that. But not everybody who gears their life around being laid back and relaxed and having a good work-life balance. Not every man who does that is mentally ill. Women are allowed to do that all the time, And if a guy spends most of his time gaming, but he's self-sufficient, then somebody there would be people in his lives who would want to get him diagnosed with something like this, because he's not necessarily as ambitious as they want, or because he's not necessarily providing them with what they want from him. But there's nothing wrong with a guy doing that. There's nothing sinful, there's nothing evil, there's nothing harmful to the rest of the people around him, and there's nothing harmful to himself. If he's happy, he's not hurting anybody. But it just the idea of men having freedom to make their own choices seems to be getting termed a negative thing, not just a bucking of the system, but damaging and harmful. How dare men have their own, have their own control over their own lives and decide what they like to do and decide what they want to do and decide how much they want to contribute to the world around them and so on.
And essentially, that's sort of where I'm disagreeing with Max with his write-up is, I think he was trying to put a spin that maybe this is a positive thing because some people can become addicted to gaming. The problem is, as far as I know, this is the only pastime that's singled out for this treatment. Is there anything like golf addicts?
Gambling, I think
gambling gambling gets it. They're working on. They may have already done it with porn. So yeah, there's other things that they've done this with, and they did hit Dungeons and Dragons with this 30 years ago, something like that. And I have run into people who they're not. It's not so much that they're addicted to role play games, but that their inability to separate fantasy from reality manifests.
It's a lot to do with dopamine. This is. I mean, I think that's why gambling is in there, because when people have like dopamine restrictions, they get addicted to gambling because it's the only thing that sort of fires those circuits, so to speak.
Yeah.
So in theory, you could apply this to anything, any activity that people get addicted to. But yeah,
So next,
as
we're
we
gonna
said, for some reason it's been put on gaming now, when it could be put on literally any activity that a
we're gonna get the
dopamine deprived person would get addicted to.
yeah, we're gonna end up with the Reddit version where your psychiatrist just says you are doing that too much. Try again in 9 minutes.
Ha ha ha.
um,
Dopamine addiction. You guys know that we have that. We're vulnerable to that because we're pair bonders, right?
okay.
So a lot of this could also be dopamine addictions, at least in men, and possibly women. Although I'm not sure if they're being singled out for this. Could be a result of lack of reproductive opportunities too.
That could be.
Yeah.
Got 2 super chats here. We have Joey Jojo gave us $2 and says, "All I do is either working or gaming. Her before me." Then we have French Honey Badger gave us $5 and says, "Having a gaming disorder is like defining drapetomania, the idea that slaves that want to escape captivity have a mental illness," which is what you were talking about earlier, I believe.
Yes, you're late to the party, French Honey
Escapism.
Badger. But yeah, you could. I'm surprised misogyny isn't in the DSM at this point as a similar sort of condition.
Yeah,
Because whenever
just give it time. Give it time.
Whenever MGTOWs or whatever express that they don't particularly want to do this anymore, that's a mental condition. I don't particularly want to be tied to a massa. Thank you very much. Oh my God, he's mental.
Yeah, well, they do they do at the very least the psychiatric profession, I should say, not the diagnostic statistical manual, but the psychiatric profession, the end of it that does marriage counseling. If you ever go into marriage counseling, the man gets all of the blame. And quite frequently, what they do is men and women will go in there together, sit at opposite ends of the couch, and she'll talk about all of the problems that she has with their marriage and all of what she's not getting out of it, and all of what he's doing wrong, and all of how she feels about all of that. And they'll start working through her side of things, and they'll get to an even keel where she's satisfied, and then it's time to work on his end of it, and she doesn't want to go anymore because she's done. She was satisfied.
And with that, let's go into the next news item. Sweden changing up consent laws by Andrew G. Back in December, Swedish Deputy Prime Minister Isabella Lövin said that #MeToo, quote, has shown that there is a need, end quote, for new legislation. When originally reported by the Associated Press, it was described as changing the law to requiring explicit consent before any sexual interaction, as well as shifting the burden of proof to the defendant. Since then, the AP has issued a correction on the story, saying, in a story December 20th about a new sexual assault law being proposed in Sweden, the Associated Press reported erroneously, based on comments from Deputy Prime Minister Isabella Lövin, what an appropriate name, what the law would do. The law would require people to get explicit consent before sexual contact, but would not shift the burden of proof from the victim to the alleged attacker. Despite what the AP claims, consent is a very tricky thing, and based on what we have seen in previous sexual assault cases, it's possible for someone to revoke consent during the sexual encounter. Even in the AP's corrected story, in Sweden, the prosecution must present evidence to the court proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused has committed the crime. Following the changes in the law, the prosecution will have to present evidence demonstrating that the sexual act was non-consensual. All that the prosecution would require is the accuser saying that the defendant didn't get consent beforehand. This potential Swedish law would definitely lead to more false convictions.
So Prime you're going to say I told you so?
Prime Minister Isabella Lövin. Sorry.
Are you going to say I told you so? Because I remember you predicting this. When all of the news was coming out about the migrant rapes and everything, and this was predicted over Germany, not over Sweden, but they've got the same news coming out of Sweden that came out of Germany, where we're hearing about all these migrant rapes, and and the excuse is, well, it's just their culture, they don't know any better, they don't understand consent, and blah blah blah. But you predicted, I remember you predicting that this was going to be used to attack men in general and label all men rapists and start restricting interpersonal relationships. And this is a definite restriction of interpersonal relationships because now men can't have them with women. Essentially, they're put in a position where no matter what they do not have a defense against being accused of rape, regardless of their intentions and regardless of their actual behavior.
I'm just I actually predicted it a long time ago when feminists first started to agitate to move the burden of proof onto the defendant, which is it's unspeakable. You might as well kiss your laws goodbye at that point. And also require explicit consent. How they define explicit consent, I don't know, but in many cases, yeah, it just gets worse. Essentially, that's what's so hilarious about this, or not hilarious, but disturbing. When the Dear Colleague letter came out, which moved sexual assault crimes, the amount of evidence in sexual assault crimes from, I believe, the preponderance to more likely than not.
It was from beyond a reasonable doubt to preponderance being 51%.
Yeah. Beyond a reasonable doubt to preponderance, which could be as little as 50.1%. As little as the person who's adjudicating over this deciding that he or she just believes accusers because only 2% of rape claims are false, according to feminists. So when that came in, I remember distinctly. I was actually posting on the Spearhead before it went sort of south, and we were discussing how rape cases were handled by the police, and we were discussing about how they were mishandled by the police, and that there was a bias against the accused rather than and for the accuser, and also talking about the rape shield laws and why do we need a specific crime that needs its own set of rules regarding evidence of innocence. Why do we need to have a specific set of rules for one specific crime that's different than any other crime? And then this came in, and it was like rape shield laws completely forgotten, because now we had to deal with this tidal wave of politicized behavior, like politicizing rape and rape accusations on college campuses, and all of the young men who've had their lives destroyed by it based on flimsy evidence, based on even no evidence. They were just kicked out, and that turned out there was no evidence, or the accuser recanted, but they have this on their permanent record. And I remember when this happened thinking, it just gets worse. It always gets worse. Even with the repeal of Dear Colleague, we have institutions just deciding to continue with it. And so the repeal really hasn't done much of anything. And then on top of it, Dear Colleague itself was another bunch of like a sprint forward into this society. I'm just trying to grasp the society that these individuals, the rape grievance industry, is trying to build. They're trying to build a society in which a woman utters a word and a man is removed from his job, removed from his social circle, ostracized, jailed, and they want to move it to jail too. They just want to be able to they just want to be able to make men go dark. They just want to be able to point their finger at any man and then just sever him from society. And what kind of society is that going to create if women all have this power? It's a society that's not going to last very long. Okay, go ahead.
I'm going to be honest. They're not thinking that far ahead. I don't think that they're thinking that far ahead of all. What they want to create is a society in which a woman points her finger at a man, and in doing so, justifies the active, like basically activates every single organization that they've created surrounding this particular manufactured epidemic. And so all of a sudden now all of their jobs are justified. All of their organizations are awash in money that our society will be throwing at them to solve this terrible problem of the criminalization of basically normal flirting and normal sexual relationships, coyness, give and take, baby, it's cold outside, that kind of thing. The criminalization of that, basically creating this epidemic of criminal activity. It is very much like and this is not a pro drunk driving statement. Okay, I'm going to preface this with that because uh, folks don't know my history. I've got a family member I was in the car with them that was almost killed by a drunk driver. So I am against drunk driving. I'm also against criminalizing more and more normal levels of alcohol in your system. And that's what's being done is they're slowly, incrementally reducing the amount of alcohol you can have in your system and be considered too intoxicated to drive a car or to be out in public even. And they're going to do that with consent as well, and eventually they'll get it down to if you're one of those people that turns sugar into alcohol in your system and you eat a meal that's heavy carbs, you're a drunk driver. Well, every time they reduce the level of alcohol that can be in your blood, every time they shrink that number down a little more, all of a sudden there's a wave, there's an epidemic of drunk driving again. It gets better and better and better, and they reduce it and they reduce it, and more people become compliant. And then all of a sudden, for some reason, they have to make it so that it's now a lower amount. And then all of a sudden there's an epidemic again. And that's basically what they're doing here as well. Every time society gets to a point where the crime is quite obviously being eliminated, where it's become quite obviously rare, and there's quite obviously not a need for an entire network of organizations, an entire area of professions, not just a profession, but area of professions dedicated to assisting women who are victims of sexual assault. Every time it gets to the point where it's obvious we don't need all of that, they criminalize a more normal degree of interpersonal relationships in heterosexual romantic relationships. And that's basically what we're looking at here. The other thing that I wanted to point out regarding this is with respect to the consent factor, that only goes one way with feminists. Like they'll say the words, this is genderless, and they'll say men's consent matters too. And then they will talk exclusively about women's right to refuse and women's consent and how important it is for women's consent to be sought and how important it is to get the woman's consent or not do anything. And how it's an assault if the woman doesn't, if her consent is not enthusiastic and so on. Never will they really talk about a guy's consent being that important unless they're talking about gay relationships, because feminism is not about equality. They're not about equal accountability. They're not about equal right to have your bodily autonomy recognized. They don't care about guys' bodily autonomy in relation to female sex seeking. And they don't care if men are wounded in any way, shape, or form by sexually aggressive women. So they don't talk about that. They barely even talk about women being affected by sexually aggressive women. And if they do talk about it, they have to talk about how men think it's hot. That's it. They won't talk about anything in relation to to say this consent standard that we're talking about. She has to ask too. His consent has to be explicit too. He has to say, yes, I want to do this. And they will treat a woman who is sexually aggressive as if she has not consented if she didn't say the words. So girls, get, like Karen always says, get ready to get out your pom-poms and get ready to say, well, maybe not Simon says, Simone says, because you don't get any attention anymore unless you're blunt, because you don't deserve it. You have asked that men not witness your behavior as consent. You stick your hand down his pants, you didn't consent to touch his penis, you're not allowed to do that now. You got to say, hey, can I touch your penis? And if he doesn't say yes, you're a sexual assailant.
It's a different, it would definitely be a different world. I wanted to say something on feminists and male victims of rape. I think that this is something that you can also apply to, I guess, more conservative non-feminists, because I see plenty of them saying, oh, yeah, the 12-year-old boy who was raped by his teacher, enjoyed it. It's a good thing. And there is that. Of course, in that case, it's more of a situation where they're just, hanging out in comments saying this stuff. They're not actually in our statistics, in our government statistics, and in our laws, and in our support centers with their fingers in all the pies. But I wanted to also point out that if feminists in general actually cared about male victims, they would understand the statistics the way we understand them. And they would be extremely sensitive to marginalization of male victims as being rare, or minority victims of sexual assault and rape, if the statistics don't actually solidly bear that out. And furthermore, what is the point of bringing it up? As long as you get resources to people who are victims of rape and sexual assault, what does it matter which gender is more likely to be raped or sexually assaulted? It doesn't even make sense to me to put this kind of emphasis on it. And like Hannah was saying, if feminists really cared about male victims, they would be as sensitive to potential marginalization of male victims as we are, and would have done as much research into the situation for male victims as we have done. The only feminist, presumably, that I know who does research into these things is Louise Stanhow, I think. Louise Stanhow, who did an analysis of the CDC's national crime survey.
Partner in sexual violence?
No. It was the national crime.
Okay.
Yes, the National Crime Victim Survey, and found that 40% of the victims of sexual assault and rape were men on a crime victimization survey, which is unheard of because it requires a man to admit that he was sexually victimized in a criminal way, often to somebody who's interviewing him over the phone or on a crime survey, crime survey form. So it's a situation where it's unheard of because men don't talk about this kind of thing.
Uh-oh.
Did we lose Allison?
It sounds like we lost Allison.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there
we
Okay.
You heard men don't talk about this kind of thing, and then you disappeared.
A lot of male victims of sexual assault and violence are essentially cowed by the dominant narrative into silence. They just conform to it and they keep their head down. And it was unbelievable to me. And it was actually a moment of pride to see that how many male victims were coming forward in a situation where usually they would stay silent. How many were actually owning their experience and saying, hey, no, this was a violation of my person and you don't get to do that. And I'm going to call it what it is, instead of conforming to the dominant narrative, being quiet, being meek, being silent, like a lot of men are expected to do when they're talking about these kinds of issues. And but yeah, so Louise Stanhow is the only feminist I know who's, I think, from what I can see, possibly in a similar playing field, as passionate about these issues as we are. Although she comes at it from a feminist point of view. Now, I don't know if that is because she's trying to make sure this stuff gets out and she's just playing the game, or if it's genuine belief. I mean, because judging from what I've been hearing from the Prim Reaper in her courses on psychology, there is a very powerful orthodoxy. And Louise Stenau may actually be making a bargain with the devil to get this information out. So I can't.
Ask, guys. Okay, so I've been awake for more than 24 hours. And ask,
a badger?
No, God damn it.
Ask her?
No, sorry guys. Not a female, okay? Was, shit, he's one of our friends. He was.
Okay, all right. I think.
Hannah needs sleep.
Yeah, you need sleep, and I feel terrible
Ask
because I'm
Dr.
keeping
Farrell.
you from it. Oh yeah, Warren
God.
Farrell. That's a good plan.
The orthodoxy. This is like I went from, you said orthodoxy, and the first thing I was thinking of was his conversation with or his interview that he was in with Gloria Steinem, and he started talking about the fact that there's been improvement, and for some reason, probably because of fame and my being so tired, Will Ferrell's name wouldn't get out of my head. And so I'm like, all right, why can't I think of the right first name? This is terrible. I did this at my grandmother's funeral with my aunt for the same reason. I'd been up for like 36 hours, and all of a sudden, it just did. My aunt's real name just didn't sound right. So it's just a fatigue thing. But what Dr. Farrell experienced was they were quite happy to have him as a president of the National Organization for Women when he was a diehard feminist. They were quite happy to have him talk about women's issues when he was an obedient little male feminist that towed the line and did what they wanted and said what they wanted and everything. But the minute he broke orthodoxy, and all he broke orthodoxy with was the statement that, yes, there's been progress, but there's still so much farther to go. So he was still saying that feminism was necessary. He was still saying that there was the inequality that women faced, and that there were legal changes, and that there was reform that needed to happen. And just by saying there had been progress, he got kicked out of the feminist movement. He lost, his entire world of professional speaking, book deals, everything that he had. And it was like all of a sudden he was persona non grata just for saying things are improving. But there's still so much farther to go. Not we don't need feminism anymore. Not fuck you, Gloria, I'm out of here. Nothing like that. No, just things are improving. The victim status. He threatened the victim status. He threatened the golden goose. And they kicked him out.
So sometimes you wonder with individuals like Louise Stenau if it really is an authentic belief, or if it's just trying to push things under the radar and get the statistics out there and get the reality out there for male victims. But regardless, I appreciate the work that she's done, whether or not she's a genuine feminist or she's basically just playing the political game as best she can in order to serve male victims. But I wanted to bring her up just as the possibly the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah. Well, and I see this sometimes with Christina Hoff Sommers. That some of the stuff that she says, is factual feminism, and some of the stuff that she attributes to feminism is very much not feminist. And feminists hate her. A lot of them try to refer to it. There's like this whole dialogue page on Wikipedia between feminists demanding that she be called anti-feminist, and she can't be included in the feminist orthodoxy because she says things they don't like. And she continues to differentiate between equity feminism and gender feminism, and there's a whole class of young feminists following her who differentiate between gender feminism and equity feminism. And I think if they took over the feminist movement, it still would be an unnecessary movement and it still wouldn't be perfect, but it might be a movement that we could actually achieve legal reform by cooperating with them where we could find common ground. We can't find common ground with gender feminists at all. Gender feminists are assholes, and they're always going to be assholes. That's all they're about. But it's this thing of coming at this from a feminist angle. You're right. She may be doing this specifically because it's the only way to get it reported on.
Yeah, I mean, and there's some genuine stuff in what she says too. When you promote this idea that women are victims of something, you continue to promote this uncritical impression that women are victims of everything. Especially when you don't look at the science and actually say, okay, well, is this something that is proven by the statistics? And it's not. Statistically, it is not an honest statement to say that women are raped more than men. Even women are raped more by the opposite sex than men are raped by the opposite sex. These are not honest statements. An honest statement would be, we don't know. Simple as that.
That is true. And we have a bunch of super chats building up, so I'm going to build some things. I'm going to read some things. Some of this goes back to earlier parts of the discussion. Joey Jojo gave us $2 and said, "This is why the women will be replaced by robots."
We're slowly figuring out how to spell that word. I like it with an H. I like it with an H.
Yeah, because it's like being smacked upside the head with gynocentrism every time when you come across one.
I think we should pronounce it whammon. I like it.
Yeah, women.
And I also I like the fact that it's a way of distinguishing women from women.
Yeah. Like feminists distinguish themselves from other women by spelling it with a Y. Well, now we can describe these super gynocentric women as women. But then we have Field of Bears, who gave us $5 and says, "The men's need to protect the women's from the men's because all men's is rapist." And yeah, that's about how much sense feminism makes. And that was TEH. Sorry, dyslexia. I corrected it. Hoki Bukisa gave us $4.20. Says, "I gotta have more cowbell." That popped up like right in the middle of me talking about being.
This is me.
Is that really a cowbell?
This is me playing the cowbell. Yeah, it's totally a cowbell.
So that would definitely wake me up. Flack the Jack gave us $5 and says, "If Hannah falls asleep in the woods, do her snores sound like clever tree puns?" And Flack the Jack, I wouldn't know.
Well, presumably because you're asleep. You'll have to record yourself.
No, I wouldn't know. And I would hope, as tired as I am, that you guys would all leave me alone.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular.
This is Punny Badger Radio.
Also, who with a zero gives us $5 Canadian and says nothing. A person of few words. I like it.
Thank you. Thank you, Zero, and your few words. All right, I guess he's just giving us a tip for being awesome.
There we go.
And he's not wrong. Okay, so Bitcoin, currency of hate. Currency of hate. 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 Oh, shit. I'm going to cough now. All right, Currency of Hate by Mike J. The Southern Poverty Law Center, the same group that labeled Pepe the Frog a hate symbol, back in late 2016 are now calling the cryptocurrency known as Bitcoin a tool of the alt-right. White nationalists and racists. They argue that since transactions are relatively autonomous or anonymous, Bitcoin is used by hate groups that have since been refused by payment services such as PayPal and Amazon Smile. However, the service is not completely anonymous. Transactions can be traced with enough information, at least according to Forbes, who did their own testing. The Southern Poverty Law Center claims to have traced 200 Bitcoin accounts to white nationalists and racists and will release the list later this week.
Okay, I'll tell you who Bitcoin is popular with. Drug dealers. I think that might be why it's soaring in price, because people have figured out that you can buy black tar heroin with Bitcoin, and and you can't be tracked down because of it. And as usual, they're not just saying, oh, these people shouldn't be taking these drugs. They're connecting it to some kind of reefer madness, whatever the reefer madness is in the 21st century. You can't just say, oh, people are taking substances that we don't want them to take. They're fucking hate groups. 200 Bitcoin accounts to white nationalists? Mate, 200 is nothing. Do you have any idea? Okay, I should stop talking now.
The stupid thing about this is they should have already learned their lesson. The last time they did this, they didn't do it with Bitcoin, but they did release the names of a bunch of groups that they had labeled white nationalists, racist groups, homophobic groups, and so on. And there was a violent attack against one group, at least. There were some other repercussions that some other groups have named, and if I understand correctly, there has been legal action. And it wasn't against the SPLC; it was against some publication that published their list. But the reality is, this kind of stuff, we're going to publish a blacklist because that's what that is. This is a list of people to not associate with, a list of people to hate, a list of people that are acceptable targets. And that is what it will be treated as. We already know that the mainstream progressive left, not alt, but the mainstream progressive left, and not the classic liberal, thinks it's okay to punch people for disagreeing with you as long as you label them racist or sexist or white nationalist. As long as you label them Nazis, it's okay to be violent. It's okay to act like a toddler in response to intellectual discussion that you disapprove of, right? So here we have this list being put out. This list of people that are acceptable targets of the ire of people who think it's okay to be violent if you disapprove of somebody. That's going to end well. I'm sure that's going to end well. I'm sure there will be no negative repercussions to this at all, right? Nothing could go wrong with that. Come on. These guys are idiots. Have they really not figured out that they're in the United States, okay? We are, I think, the most litigious country in the world when it comes to liability. We have had people successfully win court cases against victims of their crimes. That they've committed crimes against an entity and then sued that entity because they hurt themselves in the process of committing the crime. And these guys are producing a list of acceptable targets. What do they think's going to happen the first time somebody gets shot?
Well, the first time somebody loses a book deal, what do you think's going to happen?
Well, that's already going on.
Yeah, this just let loose the lawyers of war, essentially. I'm just curious how, for example, the anti-Gamergate reporter who recently was charged, not convicted yet, so we can't say that he actually did it, but charged with uttering bomb threats towards a synagogue. And this was a reporter on the left, anti-Gamergate, apparently very anti-Semitic. Is the left going to end up on that hate list, SPLC?
No, they won't. They won't do that. They won't put anybody on that hate list that they agree with politically on things like taxes and abortion and legislative control over interpersonal relationships and how much soda you can drink, how much pop you can drink for the locals here.
So it's essentially a political tool.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's totally. The SPLC is an organization that is as far as deep into the progressive left as you can get. They are not a hate watch organization. They claim to be a hate watch organization, but they are not a hate watch organization. And if they were, they would actually be dealing with stuff like that. But instead, they are labeling any group that disagrees with them on those policy issues, white nationalists um, or sexist or homophobic or so on, and then, like I said, they create lists like this, and I think they've always published this thing. They've always published something that bad mouths people. You get on their list. I mean, they published nasty stuff about the men's rights movement before too. They didn't label us a hate movement. The feminists have lied about that since for years, but they did say nasty things about us, and I wouldn't be surprised if like after the Bitcoin thing and after their hate list, they start widening their scope and going after smaller and smaller groups. After all, they're stupid enough to attach their name to this. Why not go further with it? Oh, and French Honey Badger gives us $2 and says the SPLC should put themselves on their list. They're not smart enough to do that.
They're kind of like the left-wing equivalent of the Westboro Baptist Church.
Yeah.
Anything they don't like is hate. So but they have government funding, so they're not just going to stand out in the actual reality with signs. They're going to stand on the internet with even bigger signs saying "down with this sort of thing."
Actually, I would point out, because now we're in a situation where the progressive left is not in power in the government, although the IRS might still be inundated with them. This is something that the public can complain about, because it's actually illegal for them to portray themselves as a consumer watch organization or a nonprofit. A hate watch organization, basically, when they are in fact a political propaganda organization. So this is something that you can actually look into online, how to complain to the IRS about this. They do have tax exempt status, and they should not. But we have some more super chats, and I haven't copied them over, so I'm going to read them before they disappear. Yankees Cap gave us $2 and said racism equals prejudice plus being right wing, and I will only add to that minus prejudice. You don't have to be prejudiced. You just have to be right wing. You just have to be libertarian for that matter, and they'll consider you prejudiced. If you
or
don't
classical
believe,
liberal, for that matter.
If you don't believe affirmative action is going to be necessary forever because slavery existed once, you're racist, according to these people. Then we have Who, with a big O at the end, gave us $5 Canadian and says, can you do a movie review of American Circumcision? Do you know why Cafe doesn't help male victims of infant sexual disfigurement? You're gonna have to be more specific on that, because I believe they have spoken out about this, and at this point there isn't much else that an organization can do specifically to help those individuals. Xeranx gave us $10 and said, officially Happy New Year, Badgers. Allison and Mike, that video you covered for The Rage is the best alt-right video I've ever seen. This darky is convinced to sacrifice for the white race.
It's not even
Winky face. White.
It's not even alt-right, by the way. It's full-on Nazi. I mean, the alt-right are fully on board with capitalism. This is people who don't like capitalism either. And the only people that describes are Nazis. And I don't want to fall into the same fucking trap of calling everyone you don't like a Nazi. But fucking people who worship white women but don't like capitalism, that pretty much narrows it down to Nazis. And it's amazing how many people left comments on that video and my video getting incredibly butthurt about our parody of actual Nazi propaganda. This is what it's come down to. How dare you parody actual Nazi propaganda? You obviously got some shit wrong. They were just poing you. No, they were not. They left a comment on our video very similar to the description they left on their own video, saying, no, this is a response to to feminists confronting white womanhood. And I'm like, I already covered this. The only reason intersectional feminists can say shit about white women is because they're mostly white women. The only people who can attack white women are other white women. You are not in danger. That's evidence that you're not in danger. Yeah, oh, God.
Well, and they only attack it because those particular white women didn't actually engage in the same politics or didn't act politically in the same way that, or the way that they wanted them. Yeah, it's
So did you get a lot of comments telling you that this is Nazi kind of content they want to see?
no, actually.
Oh, you.
Oh, you. Okay, no, actually, when Mike says that he got a lot of comments, and I love the comments that he got where they were implying that he'd gone kraut and tea.
Oh,
Ooh,
God.
Yeah,
shit,
the not a skeptic community has completely cucked the right community, by the way. Just like the virtue signalers have cucked the left, the woke hipsters have cucked the right. It's getting really funny now.
Could it be that people are simply getting caught up in trains of thought that are moving so fast for them that they don't actually take the time to examine those trains of thought? They just let it run them to the end, and then when it goes off the rails, they're totally surprised. Because that's the impression that I've gotten from this latest controversy, is that a group of people basically did that, and now they're trying to justify staying on the train until it went off the rails because they don't have any other out but to admit that that was a really dumb idea.
I'm not sure. I think it's just I think it's a form of sort of like what I would consider to be moralistic egotism, where you just expect everybody to have the same ideological beliefs and opinions as yourself.
I've run into that in the movement too. That's why I think it's been about 3 years now since I made a video a while back called "Cut to the Chase." It was before the whole controversy over the kid chase. But the basics, the basic premise of the video was our stuff that we fight for, men's rights. There's not a left-right angle to this. There's not a religious, non-religious angle to this. It's about whether or not a human right applies to all human beings, whether or not human accountability applies to all human beings. There's no religious or non-religious angle. There's no, or anti-religious angle, I should say. There's no left, right. There's no up, down. It's just very simple. And so to say that one side or the other of a particular political fence or one facet of the political spectrum has to be the way that you go with this is inherently wrong. And to say that one facet of the ordinary political spectrum, whether it be any of those that I've mentioned or something else like libertarianism or authoritarianism, should absolutely under all circumstances be excluded because it's just wrong. That's also useless, because it gets you away from that bottom line. Human rights, do they apply to all humans or not? Adult accountability, does it apply to all competent adults or not? And that's what we need to work on. That's what we need to base any reform efforts on. That's the bottom line. And it gets way overcomplicated, and people get into these moralistic arguments because they get these ideas that if it's not the political party that they grew up worshiping, or the idealistic outlook that they grew up worshiping, and the utopia that they want to create, it's not good enough.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of cases, what happens is that with the skeptosphere, as it were, I know I don't want to get into a debate on whether or not it exists, but I think that there was whether or not it's actually imploded. I think there was it may have been, as Mike has put out in his video, a lack of a common purpose that allowed people to just set aside this sort of moral egotism of expecting everyone to believe the exact same thing as you do. It's not important if you have a shared goal, if you have a shared purpose, if you're building towards something, that everybody believe as you do, just as long as they are beneficial to the process of building whatever you're building. And I don't think that there was anything in that quote unquote community. I don't even know if it's a community that really functioned in that way to just be a common purpose that people could agree upon, even if they disagreed on other things like libertarianism, anarchism, communism, socialism, feminism. If we're talking about those kinds of feminists we could probably actually work with, theoretically, if they weren't currently more interested in working with the gender feminists.
Well, I mean, feminism caused the first implosion that I witnessed of the skeptosphere, I guess would be the best, the skeptic population, because they're not, I wouldn't call them a community either. You have to at least have some mutual association with each other, and some shared, something shared besides, hey, we're all skeptic, to be a community. But
yeah, we
there's
all
cliques.
skepticize.
Yeah, we all skepticize. And it's just like I wouldn't call us the men's rights community. I would say that there's a movement here, but I would say that there's several communities within it. And I suppose the skeptics, they're kind of a movement too, in a way, because they're a critical thought movement, and there's definitely cliques within that movement, and that it was when the clique that their failure at critical thought was in evaluating feminism, that attacked the other cliques. And each one has some area where, they fail at critical thought. Everybody's going to have that. Everybody has their sort of pet ideals and pet beliefs that maybe they don't examine as hard as they should. Um, and that's basically how they imploded the last time. So now we have the moralistic thing, and it's sort of a similar situation, where they have these near and dear beliefs that they didn't examine as hard as they should have. They weren't. That's where they failed in their skepticism, and it's just going to be one of those things where they're going to go through trial by fire repeatedly until they hone their skills.
I just wanted to point out. Yeah. Although I want to get into that, but I just want to point out something. There were a bunch of people from quote unquote the alt-right who prophesized doom upon Mike's channel because he put this, and the thing is that, guys, it's my fault. I'm the one who said we got to do this to Mike.
I totally wanted to as well. I thought about it before you suggested it.
Okay, all right. Well, okay, fair enough. It was a mutual thing. But these people are prophesying. So what?
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. You got to mute.
I am muted.
No, you're not.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hold on.
All right, there. Now you're muted. Okay, so apparently it was mutual. It wasn't just me. I didn't force this upon Mike. But regardless, people have prophesized that this is going to be the end of your channel. And I'm looking at these comments and I'm like, do you realize that we're not? I mean, yeah, we have overlap with the skeptosphere, quote unquote, but we are a separate thing. And we're motivated by separate things. And our audiences are not the same. And in fact, I think probably our audiences, the alt-right, like the extreme alt-right aspects of our audiences probably split from us after the Cologne video and said, see you later. And since then, the approach that we take isn't really conducive to acquiring a large audience of people who have no interest in questioning themselves or regarding their ideological opponents to be subhuman. Except, of course, when it comes to communists. Sorry there.
So essentially, are we now shoved into the alt-right?
I have no fun. I'm not happy.
We're shoved into the alt-right by the alt-left, and we're shoved into the alt-left by the alt-right. That's how you know you're doing something right.
So this calls for a parody. All right now, baby, you're all right now.
And then they call us centrists, right? And I'm like,
oh dear God, that's an insult. I don't take being called alt-right as an insult. I don't take being called alt-left as an insult. But call me a fucking centrist, and I am insulted.
I don't think that I don't think they understand. It's not centrism. It's like the Z axis and the X and Y. We're on our own axis. We're doing our own thing. You know, we're up in another dimension. We're not at the center of either the alt left or the alt right. I think we're just floating around somewhere with our bad self doing our own thing.
I think we might be towards the libertarian end of the spectrum because we're saying, how about you liberate men as well?
Yeah, that's true.
Which makes sense to libertarians, some of them, but doesn't make sense to the left or the right or the virtue signalers or the woke hipsters. Because they're all entrenched in like, why would you give men rights? That's so lame. You fucking ogre fedora something or other.
I have corralled one of your commenters, Mike.
Corralled.
Have you?
Yes, I found him.
I'd like to see that.
See if I can get this.
But anyway, so when I responded to these dire prophecies, I can't really hear that very well.
Oh, it's too quiet.
I heard do, and I think I get
Let
the
me see
idea.
if I can increase the volume of this at all. No.
Well,
I
this
can't.
stream has rapidly gone in interesting directions. But anyway, what I wanted to say is that I don't think that the individuals who are from the alt-right who are currently prophesizing your doom, Mike, really understand the actual constituency of your audience. I think if you make them laugh, they'll be happy.
They're a very loud minority. They're on a high. They think they've defeated someone because of the Kraut server thing. They think they've we've defeated not the left. We've defeated the skeptics. We've done nothing. I mean, it was basically the left wing who did all of this, but we're going to blame it all on this winter's hot meme instead. This is largely why the right keeps losing, because they blame shit on their favorite meme instead of the left.
Or alternatively, they don't actually recognize the problem that they're creating by putting women in a position where they cannot. We're not actually questioning that, because this is when I was talking about how the right and the left are both part of the Church of Women Worsting. This is a perfect situation. That woman, that white woman, was women worsting from dusk to dawn in her video. She was setting up this enormous threat narrative, and men die when women set up threat narratives like this. That men die. And the right doesn't call women out when they do this, which means that they are not going to ever be able to deal with what's going to end up fucking our society over, which isn't going to be the ogres at the gate. It's going to be the women spinning threat narratives that destroy cooperation, our institutions of cooperation in society, are just our institutions, period. As we can see, as Hollywood spontaneously decapitates itself. And they can't address this because they are also within the Church of Women Worsting.
You know, what's really sad is it didn't used to be quite as polarized as it is now in terms of that women worsting. And the reason I know is kind of odd. I like to watch older television shows and stuff like that. I watch like the middle-aged old farts TV channel, local TV channel here and everything that has stuff like Svengoolie on it and the Twilight Zone and all that. And it has an old cowboy show that I like to watch. Actually, it's got a couple of old cowboy shows that I like to watch. And on those shows, they periodically will have an episode of the show that portrays a woman using a threat narrative to get what she wants. And I like, there's one episode of one that I particularly remember where a woman came into this little town, out west, with her boyfriend, needing money, and he was a professional gambler, and she didn't trust him to win enough money on his own, and so she picked out a rich guy that she didn't like in town that she had seen some other place. She had a history with this guy, and he was a terrible person or whatever. Or no, it was the guy that he owed the money to, if I remember right. And she tried to create a rape threat narrative. And of course, the main character of this is always like the good guy, the white hat cowboy. He sees right through this shit, and he doesn't fall for it, and he catches her in the act, and she ends up, in trouble and everything. and then of course to add insult to injury, her professional gambler boyfriend had won the money. So it was sort of a preachy thing, you didn't even need to do this. Why did you bother doing this? But that's the way it kind of went. And I'm going to try one more time with the corralled commenter.
Oh, I gotcha. Doom. It's the Doom song. Okay, it's still a little bit low.
Yeah. Well, it's because I took it away from the microphone, but that's the only way I could fade it out. But there we go. This is the commenter, the Doom song, and that's
all right.
That's what we get.
Okay, so let's read the final super chats.
Let's see.
Super chats, not stats.
Super chat. Yeah, there's more than one here. So we got French Honey Badger. Oh wait. There's Joey Jojo gave us $2 and says, "White women love my ogre dick." It was in all caps, so that's as loud as I can get without like blasting your ears. Sorry, guys. French, and blame Joey Jojo for typing in all caps. French Honey Badger gave us $20 and said, "I would say there is a political angle to does a right/accountability apply to all humans, given that one side does believe it's okay to violate the rights of some people for the benefit of others or of the collective." I would say that happens sort of on both sides, depending on which issues you're talking about. And I've seen it. For instance, it was not the left that put into place the part of welfare reform that created the incentive for states to go after men for more child support than they could pay. That was the right. The incentive to collect more child support. They pay the states a bounty, essentially, for every man's head that they put on the chopping block financially. And they do it under the guise of family accountability. They don't admit that custodial single motherhood is a choice. They don't admit that it takes two to tango. They don't admit that men didn't put women in a bad position and then abandon them in many of these cases, but the other way around. Women got into these positions and then shut the father out of the child's life. And in some cases refused to get married and everything when they were asked. So it's both sides. It just really depends on the issue. The left, there's a wider variety of issues that the progressive left does it on. I would say the classic liberal is less likely to do it on some of those issues, and they're less likely to do it on some of the right issues, but they're still not perfect. And the closest you're going to get is a somewhere in between, maybe libertarianism and authoritarianism, where they're not left or right, but simply decide that if a law is going to determine something to be a right that deserves protection, that there isn't anybody that's excluded from that protection. And if they are going to create an obligation or a penalty based on such laws, that nobody is excluded from being impacted by that penalty or that obligation. You have to do it, no matter what sex or race or religion of adult you are, of competent adult you are. If you're competent, you're accountable, and that's the only thing that we can do. And it's going to be tough because society really has a blind spot for accountability when it comes to women, and it's going to take fighting very hard to open that blind spot up, open the eyes to that blind spot, and make people see that women can be accountable and society must hold women accountable. Then we have Zomara 0292. It says, "Let's sing the Doom song. Thank you so much." So I there's at least one person that recognized it. Awesome. And with that, I'll kick it back to Allison.
Invader Zim fans, hype in the house.
I actually want to just extend some of the conversation that you were saying, Hannah. But first, I'm just going to tell everyone that we will be doing an after show for our patrons, and we will be covering 2 articles, possibly. One is why you should buy your teenage kids sex toys, and what they mean is why you should buy your teenage daughter a sex toy.
What?
And oh my God, this is so fucked up. Inside Silicon Valley's dark side, in which we're going to talk about apparently the orgiastic cuddle puddles of the tech giants. So those are the items that we're going to be covering in the after show. If you want to become a patron, do go to www.patreon.com/honeybadgerradio. That will get you immediate access into the Discord, $5 and then you're in. $30 to take part in the Thursday after show. You can look at the rewards on the list. It's to the right. Anyway, if you want to see that, those great and glorious topics, do go to www.patreon.com/honeybadgerradio. You can also go to feedthebadger.com if you do not like Patreon. However, you will not be getting a rank once you get into Discord. That has to be assigned to you, so you need to go to customer support and request that. Now, on to my comment on what Hannah was saying. Okay. And I think this actually speaks to both the skeptosphere community, the right and the left. They operate on a motivational system, and we can see this with the white woman video that me and Mike put out. White women are the right's vulnerability object. So they see the world in terms of protecting and providing for the white woman. And they cannot see the world in terms of giving her appropriate consequences and responsibilities to her actions, because she is their infant in the cradle that must be constantly guarded and protected. And to give her responsibilities would just be blasphemous. And you can see that with our parody of the white women from the outlet right. A lot of the people who commented on that negatively are commenting on the fact that they think that we're mocking white women. We're not mocking white women. We're mocking the idea that they have a value like this. They have this value, this vulnerability value that exists regardless of what they do, what kind of horrendous actions they take, and that they should be used at the center of threat narratives that cause men to lose their lives in service of them. This is the same thing we see from feminists. They use women's vulnerabilities as political bargaining chips in order to take over communities, take over lobbying groups, take over politics. This idea of a woman as a victim and just being a victim, and how men need to save her, need to protect her, need to provide for her. It's an incredible motivating narrative. It's an incredible motivating story, and it motivates so much in our culture. And I was thinking about this after the Kilroy event imploded, although it may still be going on, but for the most part, it has basically imploded. And I'm thinking about being motivated by this narrative, and how being motivated by this narrative is almost our entire society. Almost our entire society is motivated by the narrative of female victimhood, from men who would be significantly less productive in their jobs if they didn't have to get jobs to be able to provide for women, to have prospects and reproductive prospects, to the feminists who use the narrative as a political tool. And you look at the flip side of it. This narrative presenting women as victims of society and men creates an identity for men, a net negative identity for men. Right out of the starting gate, men are in a situation where they have to earn themselves out of a debt to society because they are recipients of patriarchal largesse that's stolen from the mouths of women. And that creates men who are absolutely driven for achievement, to earn themselves out of that value hole. And it also creates men who are completely shutting down. But all of this movement of capital, all of these lobby groups, all of these political organizations, all of these institutions are motivated by this narrative. of female victimhood. It's huge. And when you look at it, it just seems so daunting. It's just everywhere. It seems like something you could never defeat. You can never change. You can never even make a dent in it. And I look at that, and sometimes it's just despair to look at it, to know how much of our society is motivated by something that is, in effect, a lie. It strips women of accountability and responsibility, and it strips men of recognition of their basic humanity. And then I look at our community, what we've built, the connections we've made, the Discord, which is, I leave the Discord for 20 minutes, there's 150 messages in the main channel. People talking to each other, people helping each other, people giving each other a room to live in, helping them build stairs, making effort, and doing it all outside of the narrative of female victimhood. I can't explain this, but this community that we are a part of, this community represented by the Honey Badger Radio Discord, represented by the ICMI, represented by Cafe, this community is a miracle because somehow we have found a common purpose outside of that narrative of female victimhood, outside of the narrative that runs our entire society and is in the process of breaking it apart as well. Because believe me, society won't keep running if you weaponize female victimhood to the degree that it is being weaponized. And yet here we are, motivated by caring for each other. Not just motivated by caring for men's vulnerabilities, but recognizing that a discussion about men's vulnerabilities is also a discussion about women's strengths. Being motivated by possibly the most humanistic philosophy that exists today. It is lightning in a bottle. Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
It's like you said in a private Discord conversation earlier. Women are like the fuel, and men are like the engine, and we're getting into the impression that we just need to throw more and more fuel into the engine, and that'll make it work better. And here's us sort of saying, well, maybe we should improve the engine. Maybe the engine's maybe not more important, but equally as important as the fuel we throw into it.
Yeah, and it's definitely a message that is... What I was saying is this: it is a miracle that we exist and that we are able to find a common purpose with this and able to come together. And I don't think that we should ever underestimate what we are and what we've built. Anyway, I'm gonna let's go out to the after show.
Yes, that's an awesome place to end it.
Yeah.
Have a think, everyone, and if you disagree with us, by all means, send us some obnoxious comments. We love that shit.
Yeah, I love responding to it in equally obnoxious ways.
All right.
And don't forget to sing the Doom song.
Yes. All right, I'm going to hit the button. Good night, everyone. Thanks for turning up.